Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today my guest is Jerry Buting, whose name you might remember from the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. And we obviously spend a great deal of this talk discussing the Steven Avery pre-trial investigation, the trial and his subsequent conviction. But what hopefully this chat will sort of illuminate for you is some of the flaws that are well known in the case, and also see what Jerry actually thinks happened on that particular day. We discussed Jerry's book, The Illusion of Justice, which is out now and available from all sort of good book stockists. And we talk just about criminal justice in general. So let's get to it. Hi, Jerry. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to Criminal Justice Natters. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Good. We'll just jump straight into some questions about the Netflix documentary with the Avery case, and then with your book and things like that. But I've got a couple of questions from a couple of people. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk about something that I found in your book, which I found really interesting. You mentioned in your book that there was an investigative bias against Steven Avery regarding his lawsuit with the county. I just wonder if you could explain how you think that there was a bias.
Well, because of his first wrongful conviction, once he was exonerated and did some investigation about what happened in that case, he discovered that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department and the district attorney had in their files information about the real perpetrator in that rape, and they had it all along. And so it caused him to then file a lawsuit. This wasn't just a mistaken eyewitness identification anymore. This looked like he was being deliberately framed. And so once he filed this lawsuit, he asked for $36 million in federal court. It then became an automatic conflict of interest for anybody involved in his lawsuit to investigate him in this new Teresa Halbach missing persons case. And the county corporation counsel, the lawyer that handles civil claims for the county, recognized that and told them that the sheriff's department, Manitowoc Sheriff's Department, that they had to give up responsibility, and so they transferred it ostensibly to the neighboring county sheriff's department. And a different prosecutor was brought in, different special prosecutor also from that same county. And so given that, the Manitowoc County investigators should have had absolutely nothing to do with the investigation of Steven Avery in this Teresa Halbach case. And yet they were deeply involved. They told the public they were not. They told the public that Manitowoc was not being used for anything other than some tools and equipment, when in fact, virtually every piece of evidence that was used against Steven Avery in the Teresa Halbach case was found, in quotes, air quotes, by the Manitowoc County investigators. So yes, there was an automatic bias, not just because they were trying to get rid of this lawsuit against them, but also because Steven Avery, frankly, was embarrassing them. The information that was coming out in discovery in the civil rights case for his first wrongful conviction from 1985 was bound to embarrass the sheriff and the prosecutor's office in that county. And so they had all the motive in the world to try and remove that lawsuit from them, and to remove Steven Avery from having any ability to get money or embarrass them.
So if Steven was convicted for the Teresa Halbach killing, would that sort of nullify any compensation that the state would have to pay for his first conviction, or would he still have been entitled to that money? I know he settled it to pay legal fees, but
okay, so technically yes, legally he would have been entitled to compensation for those 18 years wrongfully convicted. But keep in mind that in America, that would mean a jury would have to award that money. And the value, the likelihood that a jury, if they believed he was guilty of murdering Teresa Halbach, dismembering her body and all of that, the likelihood that a jury would be sympathetic to him and would give him anything, certainly not millions of dollars. Many people already in the public were thinking, while the charge was pending, long before Making a Murderer came out on Netflix, but many people were already thinking, wow, who cares if he was innocent in that first case? Maybe we should have just left him locked up. At least Teresa Halbach would be alive. And so the value of that case plummeted to nil. And that's why his civil rights attorneys in that case, I think, settled for what they could.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned in that answer the idea that the sort of key points of evidence or key elements of evidence was discovered by the officers who shouldn't have been anywhere near the investigation. And I have a question from one of my students, Amelia Siemens, and she asks, do you think that the blood was planted in the RAV4? And what about the ignition key that was found after a number of other searches?
Yeah, the key is the easy one. Yes, the key was clearly, in my opinion, they were both planted, the blood and the key. The key, though, was much easier to I think, prove that it was planted because it was found in a ridiculous way after they had entered his apartment. 6 previous times. This was the 7th entry of his apartment. And now later, after Making a Murderer came out, or actually even before that, during the trial, they tried to claim, oh, those other entries were just very cursory searches. We weren't really looking but that's not at all true. We had a whole hearing before trial, and the investigating officers admitted that on the very first night that the RAV4 was discovered on the Avery salvage property, that is November 5th, they went into his little trailer and they had it was either 3 or 4 officers searching for like 3 hours. And for them not to discover this key in his bedroom was ridiculous. Secondly, why on earth would he even bring a key into his bedroom? I mean, that was ridiculous. He could have hidden that key any place. In 5,000 cars that, why would you, particularly when the couple of days before that, he had already been visited by the police asking, hey, we hear that, your property was one of the places that Teresa Halbach stopped on October 31st. Have you seen her? And he talks to them, so he knows that they're investigating. Why on earth would anybody keep a key in your own bedroom when you clearly didn't have it? So that was kind of ridiculous. They, on one hand, they want to try and make Steven Avery into this mastermind, evil killer who was able to clean up everything and leave no trace of evidence, and yet he's so stupid to bring a key into his own bedroom. So that was absurd. Then there was none of Teresa Halbach's DNA on that key, none. And they swabbed all over it, looking for it. And yet there was a small amount of Steven Avery's DNA. And in fact, at trial, the state's DNA analyst admitted that the quantity of human DNA that they found that was Steven Avery's on that key would be about consistent with what you would get from a transfer rubbing, let's say, a toothbrush against that key, like Steven Avery's toothbrush, which was in the residence and easily used as a planting mechanism. So yes, clearly the key was planted, even to the extent that in the closing argument, the prosecutor sort of conceded that. Kratz said, well, so what if the key was planted? Look at all this other evidence. Well, wait a second. If they're willing to go to that extent to plant evidence, and he's going to admit that with the key, then everything else is suspect too. Now, with the blood, viewers of Making a Murderer will know that our argument was that the source of the blood was this test tube of Steven Avery's blood that was found or a vial of blood that was in the clerk's office, unsecured, in the same building as the Manitowoc County Sheriff's, and could have easily have been accessed because it was in an unsecured location. The vial had been the little thing that was in. Excuse me, just one second. The little styrofoam package in the box that it was normally sealed with evidence tape had been slid open and just resealed with a piece of Scotch tape. That happened on a prior occasion, but the point that we made was that they had easy access to it.
Yeah.
They didn't, and there was no evidence tape sealing the stopper of the vial. So that, to us, was the most likely source for law enforcement to have used to have planted the blood in Teresa Halbach's vehicle. Kathleen Zellner, Steven Avery's new attorney, has alternative theories, but we offered what we thought the evidence most clearly pointed to, which was the blood vial.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the documentary, did it have any impact on the case as the documentary was being filmed, or was that something that could be quickly ignored and you just got on with your work, or was there an impact in constantly being followed by cameras?
Well, there wasn't, certainly for me. Now, Dean said that he had a harder time when they would be sort of set up in the corner. So there were two different kinds of filming opportunities. One was in the courtroom while we're on the record, or maybe coming in and out of the courthouse. You'd see scenes like that. But the other, and of course, when you're in court, you're completely oblivious. You should be, and we were completely oblivious to the fact that it was being filmed, because they're just these little, tiny ceiling-mounted cameras. Even back then, the equipment was small enough that it was completely, inobtrusive. And your focus is not on those cameras. Your focus is on the jury or the judge. But then the other kind of filming, we agreed, kind of reluctantly, frankly, we agreed to allow them to have some sort of behind-the-scenes, backstage access to us. And we decided to do that because we thought it would be a really interesting educational opportunity for the public, if anybody ever saw it, about what it was like to prepare for a very serious criminal case like a homicide. And so we each had our own apartments, Dean and I. They would occasionally come over, set up in the corner. They didn't ask questions. They would just sort of film us doing our job, brainstorming, preparing. And, we had a lot of work to do. So from my standpoint, I just kind of ignored them.
Yeah.
They were set up. We didn't know whether this thing was ever going to ever be shown anywhere. These were film students. We had agreed to cooperate. The Avery family was cooperating, but the likelihood that anything would ever be shown publicly was still pretty small. It turned out to take 9 years and a whole development of the market to streaming before they found a vehicle to do this with Netflix. But so it to my mind, it didn't really affect what we did or how we did it. The one proviso that we had with them was they could not film any attorney-client privileged communications between ourselves and our client.
So you have a 9-year wait from the close of the case and the wrap of filming, then 9 years until it streams. How far in advance were you notified that this was going to air on Netflix? And did the success of the show surprise you?
Yeah. So Dean and I, we were talking about this the other day. Actually, our recollection is different. He thought it was only like a week or so in advance that we knew.
Oh my!
When it was airing, I think we knew, I don't know, several weeks before. I do know that when I first heard that it was going to come out on December 18th. I thought this was a stupid marketing move. It's not a Christmas movie, right? This was a very dark kind of thing, and I just didn't think people would be really interested in it. And of course, I had forgotten that, or wasn't considering the fact that between Christmas and New Year's is a time when many people are off work, and to binge watch something like that would have been a perfect time to release it, and it actually turned out to be. But I did. Dean and I did have a preview sample of it to watch I think it was about a week before it actually came out, because we wanted to be able to meet with our former client, Steven Avery, and talk with him about it before it aired. We knew that he wouldn't be seeing it because prisons don't stream Netflix. No. And so we wanted to prepare him. And so I did watch it. Dean couldn't bring himself to watch the thing, so I watched it, and then we did meet with Steven the very day before it came out, and I thought it was very well done. I thought it was pretty gripping in the way it went from one episode to the next, and how they got people to continue to watch. But I had no idea that it would have the kind of go viral and have the kind of incredibly worldwide appeal that it proved to have.
Yeah, it's massive. I remember watching it and couldn't stop watching episode after episode about it. It was gripping. Paul Cuff asks, did the show give a balanced view of the case, or was it as one-sided as perhaps it looked from the Steven Avery perspective of things?
When it comes to the evidence that was used in the case, in the trial, it was really quite balanced, I think. The main issues that were fought over by both attorneys, both sides, the ones we spent the most time in closing arguments, the blood in the RAV4, the key in the bedroom, the bones, something else is escaping me, but those main issues were covered pretty well, I think, both sides. You saw our snippets of what we argued on those points. You saw what Ken Kratz argued on those points. You saw cross-examinations both ways. If people, now I know that after the documentary came out, Ken Kratz was really a one-man campaign to try and convince the public that this was a completely biased documentary and that all this powerful prosecution evidence was left out of it, and that's just not the case. It really isn't. There's some evidence left out that would have been prosecution evidence. There was defense evidence that was left out, and it was a 6-week trial, so they had to boil it down. They picked the main issues that we fought about the most, and those were covered. To the extent there is a defense flavor in the documentary, there is, because we agreed to allow these behind-the-scenes, out-of-court filming of our trial prep and that sort of thing. And so you get that flavor, and you get to meet the Avery family. But the same opportunities were given to the prosecution and to the Hallbox. I can understand why the Hallbox may not have wanted to participate. But we thought actually that the prosecution was going to participate. And in fact, they did sit for interviews. And we learned later. And then when it came time to actually get the releases to broadcast for Netflix, they changed their mind and they refused to sign the consent form. So that's why you don't see some of their perspective out of court. But I think that the filmmakers actually did sort of a clever approach of getting out of court interviews with the prosecutors, even without them agreeing to sit down for interviews, because what they did was they filmed these daily press conferences. And they in essence, the prosecutors were being questioned by the media, and the filmmakers were recording all of that, and then you saw a lot of that in Making a Murderer. So I don't think it's anywhere near as one-sided as some critics have claimed. I think it was really pretty fair.
Yeah. And did you know if the Ken Kratz kind of not signing the release was his decision or his boss's decision?
I don't know. I've heard a couple of different versions. I know that one of the lieutenants for the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, I believe, spent several hours doing an interview, but was told at the end, maybe by the Corporation Counsel for the county. I don't know. I've heard different versions about why they didn't, but they did refuse to sign the releases, and so that's the rule. Netflix couldn't broadcast anything without the consent of the participants. So now it's sour grapes because they don't like the way it turned out, but they had every opportunity that we did.
Indeed. In terms of the daily sort of press conferences, when I was watching the show, it almost felt like sports coaches, head coaches coming in post game to talk to the media. Is that the norm in big trials?
No, it's really not. That was unusual. That's the only case I've done that's had those kinds of. Now I've had a lot of high-profile trials where sometimes when you walk out of the courtroom in the hallway, the cameras are there, and you may answer a couple of questions and then move on. But this was actually Ken Kratz's idea.
Okay.
We did not discover this until I believe it was the Friday before the trial, when we're meeting in chambers with the judge and the prosecutors, and Mr. Kratz tells the court that the media wants to talk to me after every day, at the conclusion of every day, but I've decided I'm not going to do that. I told him I would just do every other day, and that Mike Hallbach, Teresa Hallbach's brother, would do every other day, the alternate days. And we said, no, wait a minute. By that point, it was obvious that Mike Hallbach was, in essence, acting as an agent for the prosecution. He'd given a lot of pretrial interviews, and it's like, well, that means every single day the prosecutors are talking to the media, and we're not. And so ultimately, the compromise was we would all do it once a day. At the end of the day, usually around 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. And we took turns. Sometimes I'd be standing off on the side watching prosecution. Sometimes they'd be standing watching us. And it was kind of a bizarre sort of way of doing things. So that is not the norm in most cases in America. And I don't know that I liked it that much, but we felt like we had to do it.
Yeah. So your hand was sort of forced by the fact that this was going to go on with the prosecution and right. Mike as well. Yeah.
And we felt, by the way, we felt, by the way, that we had already lost in the courtroom of public opinion long before we ever even got on the case. That Ken Kratz had this incredibly graphic, prejudicial press conference that all potential jurors saw, and so we weren't going to allow that to continue one-sided throughout the trial. Even though the jury shouldn't have been watching those press conferences, we were still not going to allow that to go on. So that's why we agreed to do it. So at least it was more balanced.
Yeah. Paul Cuff asks a question, another question, and concerning one of the major things of the show was the Brandon Dassey interrogation, whilst he wanted to just go home to go back to school. And he asks what your view is of the detectives who questioned Brendan, and did they do anything wrong? And if so, should they face any consequences? Did they face any consequences of their actions?
They did not face any consequences. In fact, they got awards. Awards for like Officers of the Year and the investigation they did. And now, at one level, what they did was frankly just what they were taught to do, because American law enforcement, by and large then, and still way too much even today, uses this very coercive, psychologically coercive technique called the Reed technique of questioning that nobody else in the world uses anymore. The UK abandoned it probably 20 years ago. So at least nobody else in the English-speaking world uses it except America. And it has, one of the reasons is because it's been found to have a higher incidence of false confessions.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly when you pair it with a vulnerable interview subject, like a youth, an inexperienced 16-year-old, or an adult with mental challenges, limitations, or in Brendan's case, both. And so they were taught to use this technique, but on the other hand, they also had some clues pretty early on that this guy was not the normal suspect, and they shouldn't have been using these kinds of technique on him. Because, for instance, they claimed later that they didn't know that Brendan was anything different than an ordinary 16-year-old. They thought he was, had no learning disabilities, special ed, none of that. Well, that's just simply not true. And the way that it's obvious it's not true is because the way they began their interrogation, they asked these questions that are taught to be used with very young children only. 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, to see if they're understanding the difference between a truth and a lie. And so they start off saying, with the 16-year-old boy, they're saying, well, now, Brendan, if I said that my sport coat is red, would that be a truth or would that be a lie? And they'd say, no, it's not. So there's no way they would have begun an interview with those kinds of preparatory questions without already knowing what they were dealing with. And yet, knowing all of that, they still used him to get at his uncle. That was really his only role. They wanted to get him, and we actually were prepared for them to use Brendan's interrogation at our trial. In fact, we wanted them to.
Yeah.
Because we had an expert who was prepared to explain to the jury how psychologically deceitful and coercive these techniques were. And to go after this 16-year-old nephew to get the uncle, we thought fit right in with the whole theme of how desperately they wanted to frame Steven Avery. That they were willing to use this kid against his uncle in this way and subject him, the 16-year-old Brendan Dassey, to as severe punishment penalties as Steven, showed the kind of bias and the desperation they had. Now, maybe one of the smartest things they did was not use Brendan at our trial, and then that meant we couldn't either, because Brendan has a Fifth Amendment right not to testify or not to incriminate himself, and we would not have been allowed, even if we wanted to, we could not have forced him to testify in Steven's case.
Do you think without that, the success, to use the air quotes, of that interrogation, that Steven would have been arrested and taken all the way down this process? Although it's not used at trial, do you think so much was made of that interview that you said you've already lost in the court of public opinion? Do you think that just played into that?
Well, it did, and keep in mind that the court of public opinion is also where our jurors were drawn from. And that would have been true whether we moved for a change of venue to a different county or not, because it was wall-to-wall coverage in all 72 counties of Wisconsin, and we couldn't leave the state. We would have had to pick a jury there somewhere, and all of the media markets were saturated with this. So Steven had already been arrested and was in custody at the time of this interrogation. It was about 4 months after his arrest. And so they were prosecuting him even without this interrogation. But it really, I think, was a sea change in the prosecution and in the public opinion thereafter. So, for instance, before the public knew anything about how the evidence was found, who found it, all they'd heard was statements from law enforcement, particularly the sheriff in the neighboring county, saying that we're in charge of this investigation, and Manitowoc is not involved at all, and that was what the general public thought. And so when Stevens originally charged and arrested and charged, they thought, well, okay, here it is. They knew from media reports and the criminal complaint that this key had been found in the bedroom, pretty damning, etc. But about a month later is when the first actual court hearing where testimony came out. And then it came out that, in fact, the key was found under these highly suspicious circumstances by Manitowoc investigators. In fact, two who were involved in had been deposed in his lawsuit just 3 weeks before she disappeared. And so when that came out, all of a sudden, people started to think, well, now, wait a minute. This is looking kind of suspicious. Stephen had given interviews right before his arrest saying they're doing this again. They're trying to frame me, plant evidence against me. And people started to wonder, well, maybe there was some truth to that, until the Brendan Dassey interrogation and press conference that followed, because Mr. Kratz gave this very graphic, gruesome story and made it come out in a way as if this Brendan Dassey had been holding this in, feeling guilty about it for months, and finally came out with this narrative explanation for what happened, and this very bloody murder, rape, stabbing, etc. And yet we found out about a month or two later, when we got the discovery in the crime lab reports, that they had to have already known at the time of that press conference that they had thoroughly searched, found no blood anywhere in his bedroom, no blood on the bedding, no blood on the walls, anything, that the evidence, in fact, disproved this story that was being told to the public in this press conference. So to my way of thinking anyway, that was sort of the watershed moment that really changed public opinion and prejudiced any potential jurors that we got later. And in fact, I think we had these juror questionnaires before the trial, and when we got them back, filled out by the 130 jurors that we were supposed to pick from, I think it was something like 129 of them answered this one question about, do you think Steven Avery is guilty or probably guilty? And they all answered yes.
Why?
So, and it was almost all because of that press conference. So yeah, it did have an effect, even though Brendan didn't testify at the trial.
Yeah. In terms of how Brendan was interrogated, is it common in the US for juveniles not to have either a lawyer present or an appropriate adult present during the police questioning?
Utterly commonplace. Utterly
Really?
commonplace. Yes, it's sad. It does not have to be. There is no, after Making a Murder came out, a few of the states have since passed laws barring that.
Yeah.
But the majority haven't. And it's not just that he didn't have an adult in the room with him. It's all of these techniques that are used. America is the only place in the English-speaking world where the police are allowed to lie to the suspect about their evidence, that they can make stuff up and say, we've got your fingerprint on the gun or your DNA here and there. And the United States Supreme Court, like 50 years ago, said that was permissible, but it was to be considered by the trial courts, the trial judges, in deciding whether or not a confession should be allowed in at all. That it would be one factor that would point towards an unduly coercive process. But in practice, what's happened over the decades since is that it's routinely done, it's routinely allowed, and every single day in America, there are 16-year-old, 15-year-old kids being interrogated by police officers in this manner.
So is that the same for adult suspects as well, to be interrogated without a lawyer? We have a right to a lawyer in the police station over here that's free, but generally speaking, less than 50% of suspects take up that right. But the right is there, and we're trying to get better at getting the defense lawyer take up. But in the States, is it again commonplace to not have a lawyer during the interrogation?
It's very commonplace. We don't have, unlike in places in the UK where there's a lawyer who is actually assigned sort of on duty
Mhm.
at the individual police stations. We don't have that in America. They always warn you. They read you your Miranda rights that everybody's heard in television and the movies, the right to remain silent, you have the right to have an attorney present. If you can't afford one, one will be provided. But it's not like we're going to walk out the door of the room and then go bring in the lawyer to talk. It's, we'll get you one at some point, but
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that you have to have one right away. And if the suspect actually invokes their right to remain silent and their right to have an attorney present, then the police are supposed to stop.
Yeah.
They can't even ask, "Are you sure? Do you want to reconsider this?" But the courts in America are frankly so bad on this issue that I had a case once where a guy, an adult, says they were using sort of a good cop, bad cop technique.
Mhm.
There's one guy alone in the room with him, and he's getting real aggressive. And my client says, "That's it." Slams his hand on the table. "That's it. I'm done talking to you. Put me back in the jail cell." Which sounds to me like a pretty clear
Yeah.
invocation of his right to remain silent, his right not to be questioned. So the detective leaves the room, and about 10 minutes later, another guy comes in and does the good cop. "Hey, I'm sorry about my partner. He's really kind of hot-headed, and he got, and sort of worms his way in and starts questioning him again." And when we challenged that later, their argument was, well, he didn't really invoke his right not to speak to anybody. He said, "I don't want to talk to you." That doesn't mean he didn't want to talk to the next guy who walked in the room. And the court bought that. And then the Court of Appeals bought that. So, there's this whole line of cases about how your invocation of the right has to be unequivocal and, no doubt in their minds.
Mhm.
And then, of course, in half of the states of America, interrogations are not even recorded. And so it becomes a swearing contest. The defendant may say, "I told him I wanted a lawyer. I told him I didn't want to talk anymore." And the cops say, "No, he didn't. We didn't." And there's no way to prove it. So, and the people who are completely innocent really have the most at risk in these kinds of interrogations because they're not equipped to deal with what the technique that they use. And yet they feel like, "I got nothing to hide. If I ask for a lawyer, they're going to think I'm guilty, right? That sounds like I'm
Mm.
lawyering up." And so there's this psychological and maybe and even cultural bias for people to say, "Oh, I'll talk to you. I have no problem talking with you." And then we see what happens with someone like Brendan.
Just to take the idea that the police can lie to the suspect. So say the suspect is an adult, and they're being questioned, but whenever the offence took place, they're under the influence of drink or some other form of intoxication. So genuinely, they can't remember what happened. Now, the police say we've got camera footage or fingerprints, or we've got some evidence that places you at this scene. And then the suspect says, "Okay, I must have done it." How easy would that to be? Could that be challenged at trial if other evidence that exonerated the suspect came to light through defence work, or is that
Well,
confession the
the,
key
con-
the key part?
confession is key.
Yeah,
It's very, very difficult to convince jurors that people falsely confess. It just is.
yeah.
Because most people would think, "I wouldn't falsely confess. What this guy must have done it if he says he did it." If you have a good, qualified expert who can explain to the jury how these psychological techniques work and what the vulnerabilities are of the defendant, it's possible to persuade jurors, and particularly if there is some evidence that refutes the confession, like in Brendan's case, the complete absence of any
Hmm.
physical evidence linking him to the crime. But if you don't go through all of that, and it's expensive, you have to hire experts, you've got to be skilled lawyers to be able to do that, frankly. It is very hard to persuade jurors to find somebody, even when the officers, now that frankly is one of the reasons why a lot of places the police have resisted the idea of recording their interrogations. In fact, they've said, well, we think it might bias the jury. They may not like the techniques. They may not like what they see is happening, how the sausage is made.
Yeah.
But our argument was, well, that's exactly why they need to see it. They're the ones who are choosing guilt or innocence, and that's the best evidence. What did you say? How did you say it? What did the suspect say? And so if they're lying, you can then show the jury. Now, you lied when you told him that his fingerprint was on this, didn't you, officer, right? And you lied when you said this, and you lied when you said that. And, all of that, they can, of course, argue, well, this is just a tough, we're going up against criminals who are sophisticated, and, we have to use these techniques and blah, blah, blah. They can justify that, but ultimately jurors are the ones who have to decide. And so that is a real problem in America.
In terms of the Avery trial, the court refusing to allow you to maybe point the finger at some third-party suspects, was that decision expected by you and Dean, or did you think you would be allowed to perhaps point the finger to show Steven's innocence rather? Sorry.
I would say I was not floored by the judge's ruling, because I've gotten a little bit jaded, perhaps, into expecting that defense gets screwed in pretrial motions. The deck, I say this somewhere in my book, the deck really is stacked against the defense to an extent that nobody understands in the general public. And this third-party suspects, what we call in Wisconsin, Denny, D-E-N-N-Y, evidence named after this case, State versus Denny, is a perfect example. It is extremely difficult to get a judge to allow you to point the finger at another suspect, even when there's decent evidence that this other person could be involved. And in the Steven Avery case, the ruling was, I think, just so unfair in turning the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof on its head, because the prosecutor never has to show that the defendant, or prove what the defendant's motive is. They have to prove that a defendant intended to kill, for instance, but not why. What was his motive? And yet, in our case, the trial judge ruled, and then the Court of Appeals agreed, that we had to do more. We had to prove not only that there was a person who had access, opportunity, and some potential connection to the crime and the crime scene, but also that they had a motive to kill Teresa Halbach. And if you think about that creates a sort of a real bias against that is arbitrarily makes a difference on whether or not the victim in a case is a bad person of ill character who has people that hate them and reasons for them to kill them, versus an innocent person like Teresa Halbach, who nobody would have a motive to kill. And if you happen to get charged with somebody like that, good luck, because you are not going to be able to introduce and point the finger at other suspects unless you can really prove that they had a motive to kill her, which is virtually impossible in most cases.
I think as well, from when I was reading your book about this and what happened in the Avery case, it just feels like I think you mentioned at the start of your answer, it weakens the state's burden of proof. It lowers it because there's something else that they don't have to account for or to counter. It just doesn't seem fair.
Well, right. And it's not just that it lowers it, it raises it on the defense, who has no burden of proof in the case. And suddenly now we do in these instances. And so that's what I mean about it turning everything on its head. It's completely backwards. And, there are the original underpinnings of that kind of a rule had some legitimacy in that, you're not supposed to just blow smoke at the jury and try and point the finger at somebody else if, in fact, the evidence shows that this person was in Hawaii at the time of the killing in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and therefore couldn't have been involved. But it's then been expanded to the point where it swallows everything, and it makes it virtually impossible. And as I say in the documentary at some point, we knew from the very beginning that one of the biggest questions this jury was going to have is, if not Steven Avery, then who? Who else could have done this? And we knew that there were other people that could have done it, and we named those other people in pretrial motions, some of whom, since the documentary has come out, have now been raised in the public's eyes as possible suspects as well. But we were not allowed to tell his jury that. And so, I've heard the various people who are what they call the guilters, who support the prosecution of this case, say, look, he had a right to a jury. He heard a jury. The jury convicted him. Well, the jury didn't hear all the evidence.
No.
They just did not hear all the evidence. And some of it we didn't even know at the time because the evidence was withheld from us and only discovered by Kathleen Zellner in the last couple of years or so.
Is that a big problem rife in the United States as well, with it disclosure or discovery being held back, suppressed, or incompetence, however you wish to describe it, on part of the police and prosecution? Is that a problem that sort of fills courts as well? Yeah,
it's a serious problem, and it's a problem that we don't even know how big it is, because it's only when they get caught that we ever find out about it. And oftentimes it's very difficult to be caught. Even in the first wrongful conviction for Steven Avery, which is talked about in the documentary, he spent 18 years in prison, and it was only after that, when somebody started digging, that they discovered in the prosecutor's own file was information about the real rapist, the real perpetrator, who later was proven by DNA to have committed this rape. So, how many years go by, and how often does it happen that evidence is suppressed from the defense and we just never know about it? And one of the problems is that in criminal cases, discovery is very limited, unlike in civil cases where somebody's suing for money. Discovery in America is wide open. You can have depositions. I can subpoena somebody into my office and sit in the conference room and depose them for hours under oath, exploring all kinds of things, much of which may not be directly admissible at trial, but might lead to something that is. You can do all of that in a civil process, but you're not allowed to do that in a criminal case. And until I think we have major reform on discovery, where the defense can really probe, not just take somebody's word for it, we've given you everything. Well, let's see. Well, let's just see if that's true. Let's start questioning people independently and see what their recollections are, and see if there's, I got a case now where there's evidence. I'm not going to mention the details of it, but there's evidence that was clearly withheld from the defense. And the other problem that you have is, if you find out later, after there's been a conviction, then the presumption of innocence is already gone. There's a presumption of guilt because you've been convicted.
Yeah.
And you have to show not only that the evidence was withheld, but that it might have been material. And that is that there's a reasonable probability. Is there a reasonable probability this might have made a difference? Well, then you're trying to go back and figure out retrospectively whether this piece of evidence, if it was presented, might have made a difference to a jury, when if it had been presented in the first instance, you could let that jury find out, decide themselves, weigh it, and decide whether it makes a difference. So, that's what pretrial discovery can do for you, where this post-trial discovery of Brady, or what you call disclosure violations, can't.
Yeah. With that, if you could pick one thing to reform the criminal justice system in the United States, would it be this pretrial disclosure regime, or would it be something else?
Oh boy, there's people ask me this all the time. What one thing? It's like there's so many things in the American justice system that need to be changed that it's really hard to narrow down. The lack of money for indigent defense is a huge chronic problem. Overworked defenders who just don't have the time or resources to match against the government and all of law enforcement behind them. Racism in America is a serious problem, and it's not even on a conscious level. It's, there's just this unconscious, deeply ingrained racism that affects outcomes and even the beginnings of who gets prosecuted and who doesn't. And forensic evidence is terribly flawed in America and really all over the world. But particularly I find in many cases in America, approximately 25% of the wrongful convictions, the exonerations that we know about, the DNA is later proven, about 25% of those were, if you went back to their trial, you saw there was flawed forensic evidence that was introduced. And that's an area that I continue to work on. I've always been interested in my whole career on. But there's maybe an even bigger fundamental thing that I've wrangled with about how to deal with this kind of issue that we have in America that I don't think you have in the UK. In fact, it's kind of a weird thing I do whenever I travel. I try and watch a court trial or jury trial in whatever judicial system it is. Even when, my wife is also a criminal defense attorney, works with me. Even we go on vacation, we try and do this. And we've watched trials in the Old Bailey. And so when Dean and I were in Scotland, we watched a trial. And we just happened to come in at the closing argument of a big homicide case with one of the best barristers in the country in the defense and one of the best for the prosecution. And we heard both their arguments. And afterwards, we looked at each other and said, oh, my God, that prosecutor's argument was the most fair and balanced I've ever seen. That could never happen in America. And, the prosecutor was openly saying, well, yeah, we got some problems. Here's the problems in my case, and here's why, and they were just, very respectful and you just would never see that in America. And I've also been contacted, I'm on Twitter and I have people write to me and they say, this could never happen here. This would never happen in the UK. Our prosecutors are much more honest and fair, and they may be on the whole. It doesn't mean it can't happen, though.
No.
There are cases where it has. But one of the things that I think is a real, both a strength and a flaw when it comes to criminal justice in America is this competitive nature that Americans have, that to win at all costs. And when it seeps into the courtroom, no matter how many times prosecutors are told you're not supposed to just win a case, you're not out for a conviction, you're out for justice. The people win when justice and fairness are served, even if there's not a conviction, on and on and on. Those words are all spoken in the court, in the cases in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. But when it gets right down to it, when you're in the heat of battle, in a trial, I see even good, fair prosecutors willing to cut corners and really let the desire to win at any cost overcome their sense of fairness. And I just think that I don't know how you get past that in America, but it's a real fundamental problem that I've seen throughout my entire career.
Okay. Thank you. So David Rudolph taught you at college. What do you remember about David during his time as your professor?
Yeah, he was he was a very young professor at the time. He was my clinical law professor at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill Law School. I met him, I think it was in my second year is when you were first able to get into a clinical program. He was the supervisor of the whole clinic. He was also my supervising attorney. And we would work on cases, brainstorm. He was great. He had a really interesting background. He worked at Legal Aid Society in New York and came down to North Carolina. And, he was really the first mentor I had on how to defend a criminal case and how to stand on my own 2 feet and talk to a court. And I had unusual. Normally, we only worked in one county, Orange County, North Carolina, where the law school is located, which frankly had a pretty low crime rate, and there was more of a, it wasn't like you could get any good juicy cases as a law clerk. But I had a guy who was forged a bunch of checks in a whole bunch of different counties, and I got to go represent him in all of these different counties, which was interesting because then I got to see different courtrooms and different judges and different local practices, and that was really valuable. But David was great. We stayed in touch over the years, long after I graduated. In fact, I knew when the Michael Peterson case was being tried, I was following that case because I was still in touch with David. And then when the staircase came out, the first time when it was on DVDs that you had to mail in for, I watched it. And then, of course, it was re-released later on Netflix. And it's a funny story we tell that when about a month or so before Netflix was re-releasing it, David called me and said, I know you've been through this whole thing with Making a Murder, and now Netflix is about to release this. What's it going to be like? What am I going to have to deal with? And I sort of laughed and said, oh, so now the pupil is going to teach the professor a little thing or two. And then I had a great opportunity with him to actually speak together on some various talks throughout America and a couple of places in Europe where we did a sort of comparison of the staircase and Making a Murder and the differences and similarities between them. So it was fun.
Just as my final question really sort of follows on to what you've just said. You've been called an internet star. What's the day-to-day stuff like? Are you recognized for being in Making a Murderer? I say being in, but
thankfully that's faded. I mean, it was very awkward at first. There's no question. I couldn't walk down the street, and particularly in big cities like New York, Chicago, or anywhere in Europe, without being stopped within a block. And I still get stopped sometimes in airports. It's weird. It's just airports. I don't know why that place of all places, but it was just really weird. I was in when it was released. Shortly after it was released, like within days, I went to Italy. Over the Christmas holidays because we had a planned visit with our son who was studying over there and couldn't come back for Christmas. So we went there. And then that's when it really blew up, of course, in between Christmas and New Year's. And I was walking around Rome, nobody recognizing me. It was amazing. They didn't have they had Netflix, but it wasn't quite as popular yet in Italy. And I was being contacted, and they said, you got to come back. You got to go do these television shows. Everybody wants to interview you. And I was like, no, this is my vacation, my time with my son. I'll come back at the end. So then they agreed to reroute me through New York on the way back. And they said, you're not going to believe it. You're going to be like, effing George Clooney. And I said, no way. There's no way. I mean, I've been walking around Rome, and sure enough, as soon as I got off the plane, it's like I didn't get one gate. Jerry, I mean, that's people recognizing you and calling you by your name.
Yeah.
But, it was very awkward at first for both Dean and I, but everybody was so nice, frankly, and everybody wanted to learn more about not just the case, but about the justice system. And that's what actually provoked Dean and I to go on a tour of cities speaking. This was our chance to talk to the public about the flaws in justice, in our justice system. The lawyers have known about for years, and we've talked to lawyers sort of preaching to the choir, but this was an opportunity to really kind of break through to the individual people who are, whose justice system it is. And so that was a wonderful opportunity to do, not just in America, but in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and to compare the justice systems. Every country has false or wrongful convictions or miscarriages of justice, as you call them. Every country, and some are more frequent than others. America, we have about 3 or 4 exonerations a week on an annual basis now, and that's a good thing. But at the rate that's happening, there are people going to die in prison who are innocent and never had their chance. So, to the extent we can raise the public awareness to prevent wrongful convictions before they happen, you're much better off than trying to undo the miscarriage of justice at the back end. And now I can say, of course, there's no travel now going on with the pandemic, but one of the things that Dean and I are really focused on now, along with University of Wisconsin Law School professor Keith Finley, we started this nonprofit called the Center for Integrity in Forensic Science, CIFS justice.org, if people are interested in looking it up. And it's the first nonprofit that's really focused solely on reform and improving the reliability of forensic evidence in our courtrooms and trying to exclude the stuff that's junk science, improve, strengthen the valid forensic evidence, because as I said, there's way too many cases of people who are wrongly convicted based on flawed forensics. And so that's kind of where we've shifted now. I do more talks with forensic scientist groups and forensic science students, and I'm hopeful that particularly with young people that are really interested in justice, that they'll take these lessons from Aiken and Murder and other cases like this and really use it to improve justice, wherever you are, whether it's America, whether it's United Kingdom, whether it's Europe, every area of the world has a need for improved justice. And to the extent that the public is aware of that and interested in it, and particularly young people motivated to see it in their futures, then I feel good about that.
Thanks, Jerry. Massively interesting talk. I'm all out of questions, so I want to thank you very much for your time. And thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Jerry, for giving us such an engaging and interesting chat concerning not only the Steven Avery case, but of criminal justice more widely in general. I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. As we've sort of mentioned throughout, Jerry's book is available, The Illusion of Justice. It's an excellent read, and I would urge you to check that out. And if you're interested in the forensic science work that Jerry mentioned in our talk, his work with the Center for Integrity in Forensic Science, you can access it on the internet. Go to CIFSjustice.org and have a look around and get involved with some of the events that Jerry's involved with there. Many thanks, everybody. I will speak to you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening.